Welcome to Cybermania, Cyber Talks with the brightest minds in cybersecurity. Discussing risks, AI, emerging threats, workforce challenges, and more. With your host, May Brooks.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Cybermania. Joining me today is Ofer Maor, the CTO and founder of Mythica. Ofer, how are you today?
Great, thanks for having me. How are you?
I'm great and thank you for joining me. I was really looking forward for this episode because you have a fascinating cybersecurity story. And as always, we start in the same way with you sharing a little bit about your crazy story in cybersecurity.
Thank you. So I just realized I'm celebrating this year 30 years in the industry. So I've
But
I've been
how is
around
that
for a while.
possible? You're so young.
I'm not as young as I look.
See?
And I started working in an early age. A bit of the usual story. IDF intelligence got pulled. I was doing IT networking, got pulled into security very early on. In the 90s, nobody knew anything about security. I look back at what we did back then, and I feel ashamed. Uh, and and right after the military, I had this great opportunity to join as the first employee of Imperva. And so, great team, great founders, learned a lot from the way. It was a great ride. I was there from the beginning, so I did everything. I did pen testing, and I did pre-sales, and I wrote code, and whatever. And after that, I decided I wanted to do startups of my own. So in 2004, I left Imperva, and I started my first company. It was a company called Hactics. And Hactics was a boutique pen testing, red teaming, application security consulting company. And we became very quickly well known here in Israel. We also had some work outside of Israel, but we became pretty much the number one company in this space in Israel. It was a great ride. I mean, it's a smaller scale, but it was a really great ride. I learned a lot. We did really incredible things. Early days of AppSec, lots of new research. Eventually, this got acquired by EY. And a little before we sold it to EY, we spun out another company from an actual startup, a product company in the application security space called Seeker Security. Seeker was the first vendor basically to do IAST, interactive application security testing. We came up through the consulting, through the pen testing, through real world. I really like this interaction with real world. We came with this need to do application security testing in another way. We built the company, and then that was eventually acquired by Synopsys. And I spent 4 more years in Synopsys, which, I never thought I would like corporate, but it was a really great ride because Synopsys at the time decided to build this mammoth AppSec vendor, and they acquired one company which is called Coverity. It's a static analysis, and then Seeker was the second acquisition. And then I joined the team, and with that team, I led security strategy there. I helped the growth. I helped 8 more acquisitions that we did. When I joined, I think we were at about 80 million in revenue. When I left, we got close to $500 million through both organic growth and acquisitions. So it was a really interesting ride. But then, at the end of the day, I'm a startup guy. So I left a little over 5 years ago. I joined forces with my co-founder from Hactics, Tal, and another co-founder, Ariel, and we founded Mythica. And after, at this point, I was already 25 years in the industry, and I kind of gave up, quote unquote, on the idea that we can really, really stop breaches. I mean, we can reduce the amount of breaches, but we can't prevent them. I can go on for the whole hour just on the economics of why this doesn't work, but we won't do it right now. But the reality is we can't reasonably prevent breaches from happening. And so as an industry, we need to get much better at detection and response and not just at prevention and protection. And even though everybody says DR, 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 right? The reality is that still most of it is not really great. It's still a much smaller investment than what people put on prevention. Because as human beings, it's much easier to try and eliminate risk than to handle risk, right?
Yeah, and to come to terms with the fact that no matter how much we invest, we will have an incident at some point. It
Right.
could be due to our fault, and it could be due to no fault of our own. And we've just seen it with the huge, huge blue screen of death with CrowdStrike. What was it? 2 weeks ago. It wasn't a cyber incident. It was no one's fault. Let's
Well,
say, well, no,
the
I'll
lawsuits
correct.
against the CrowdStrike will tell a
Uh,
different story.
exactly. So I will say it's none of the client's fault.
Right.
I will say it this way, but at the end of the day, it's not a cybersecurity incident. It's definitely an information security incident because it hurt availability. And I can tell you that at least until about 4 or 5 days ago, my kids went to the mall and wanted to go to one of their favorite restaurants, and they didn't because they still can't accept credit
Still.
cards. Still,
Yeah.
it was over a week after. It was, I think it was last Saturday or Sunday or something like that. So over a week, and that is huge because in the UAE where I live, I don't have cash. I mean, I think last time I had cash was my first week here. Sometimes I get cash only because the kids sometimes need it at school. But honestly, I have
Yeah.
no idea what the currency here looks like. I only use my credit card. So, yeah, so let's talk a little bit about your initiative throughout the years and I want to focus right now on Mitiga and incident response basically.
Sure.
You've been in the protection side for many years. You've been trying to reduce the amount of breaches and everything, and now you're on the other side.
Right.
Are we investing enough or are we investing too much in prevention?
We're not investing enough and we're investing too much at the same time. I'll try to explain that. If we zoom out a second from cyber and look at the physical world we live in, the vast majority of prevention we do is not prevention, it's deterrence. The law enforcement means that in most Western civilized countries, um, the reason that your house isn't broken into is not because you spent enough on your lock. It's because most people who are able to pick an average lock wouldn't do it because it's illegal. And it's the whole economy of security, physical security is around that. You only need to protect enough against the lower bar of attackers that are criminal enough to go against that, but the vast majority aren't. In the cyber world, the deterrence is gone. It's gone because countries give asylum, basically, to threat actors. And so it's the first time in history, really, that we're facing this place where a commercial organization needs to defend itself with zero, I'm being extreme, but with zero law enforcement support, which means they have to put security that's, in an order of magnitude bigger than what we can do. So we don't do enough prevention because we can't do enough prevention, which means, we probably need, I don't know, 10 times, 20 times more investment, and there's no financial viability to that. And so given that we don't do enough, then we do too much. Because if you're already there, then now let's look at risk, right? Risk is probability and impact. So the marginal effort of the last, I don't know, 20% we're putting on prevention is, it's reducing risk a little bit more, but not that much. Whereas we don't invest in much in response, where if we would take those 20% and put them in response, we could dramatically reduce the impact of breaches, right? We caught yesterday for one of our customers an active threat in their cloud that just began. Because we are there, because we're able to do that, it's already breached, but they didn't get to do any damage. We caught it quickly, we helped them remediate, done. So impact, almost zero.
I absolutely love that because I think that's a huge game changer. I think that we know the statistics that for many organizations and for many years, the average time between between when a hacker actually infiltrated a system and until they were found out was between 6 and 10 months, depending
Yes.
on industry. And that was sort of, we were already there. We said, okay, we'll be breached and we'll find out about it when we see it on Pastebin. Well, I don't want to be there. I don't want to find out because a journalist calls me, oh, by the way, all your data is out there. And it happens. Unfortunately, we've seen it happen many times. So as
There,
someone
there-
who's, yeah,
there's an interesting statistic about that.
okay,
So, out of big breaches, so this comes from IBM Cost of Data Breach Report, great report, 18 years
yes,
in a row. Um, the last year they published that out of the breaches they investigate, which are obviously big breaches, breaches that have an impact, only 1/3 was discovered by the organization. So 2/3 were external indicators, ransom note, press, third party, law enforcement notification, anything that's not your SOC. And so this is crazy.
yes, it is. It is. It's insane. And you mentioned law enforcement, and you mentioned it before. And I think that the biggest difference between physical security and cybersecurity is if I want to physically enter a building, I have to physically be there. I
Right.
don't have to physically be in the same country if I want to attack someone on the cyber realm. I think that's sort of the point. I think that the legal system, the global legal system, doesn't have the tools to deal with something like that. That's why we don't have deterrence, because people tell me, but how come the police doesn't do anything? What will they do? If something happens, let's say here in the UAE, well, when you investigate it, and I recently, like last week, I investigated this huge chain of, I will call it phishing, but it's super sophisticated
Right.
social engineering, and to be honest, it's done to a perfection. It is really, it's scary how good they become.
Yes.
And yeah, and I investigated it, and all indications, I found I think it's a few different networks, but one of them is coming from Ukraine/Russia, because there are
Right.
multiple indications. Another is coming from China. And we know these are sort of the immediate suspects. What do people expect? They expect the Dubai police or the UAE government to call who exactly? To call the Russian government to do what exactly? And how will
So,
they ever find them?
so
So,
20 years ago, I was involved in a case before my incident response days. Um, and it included an Israeli startup that was trying to fight spam and phishing, and they annoyed one of the biggest phishing monsters, which was from Russia, and they're part of the organized crime. And never mind, there was a whole story. They did a bunch of attacks against the U.S. and Canada, denial of service, and the police, they know the name of the person in Russia who's responsible for that. They went to the Interpol. Russia is officially part of the Interpol, and the Russia police just said, well, we don't know that person. We don't know where he is. We don't know that person. I said, of course you know that person, right?
honestly,
And
and
that's the story. And I think one of the, when you mentioned doing things from another country, again, in history, the only offenses that go between countries are wars,
so
right?
wars,
And
yeah.
and that's why I say we when people say cyber warfare, they think about nation state. But no, we are all in a cyber warfare, because this plays like a game of war, not like a game of crime.
It is. But it is crime, and
It
it
is
is
crime, of course.
super lucrative. And I think that's also part of the point. At the end of the day, in this case, unfortunately, we know that crime does pay. And the risk is lower. And I always say it when I talk about ransomware, that once upon a time, life was very simple. And when a criminal wanted to make a lot of money, they would have to physically kidnap a person of interest and hold them for ransom. But that's illegal, and law enforcement does not like it, and they'll do everything in their power to bring you to justice. And also, your captive might recognize you in the future. Not a good idea. But kidnapping your data, which for organizations today is just as, if not more important than your people, that's a different story. And it will be very hard for the legal entities to do anything about it. And we know that. We've seen some success stories. I'm not saying we haven't.
But
And
yeah,
yet.
and also think of it from the attacker's perspective. I mean, at the end of the day, it's people. Kidnapping a person is a very violent crime. Most people wouldn't feel comfortable. Even criminals are not
True.
mostly comfortable with kidnapping.
True.
Hacking into data, it's easy. You don't
Yeah, and
see the damage in your eyes. You don't feel it.
And there were a lot of researches around it. What makes hackers hack, and how come they don't feel uncomfortable, and what are the ethical boundaries? And they did an interview with quite a few reformed former phishing social engineers, whatever. And they sort of described it as a crime with no victims because even if you steal my credit card, the credit company will compensate me. So really, who's hurt by it? It's fine. That's sort of the perspective. Obviously, we know that's not fine, and we know that we are all paying for it all the time. But it's sort of perceived as a victimless crime.
It's like insurance fraud.
Which again,
it's the big finance people. I want to say one more thing. I want to go back for one thing because you asked me about are we investing too much or not enough. I also want to say that I think in a lot of cases we're not investing necessarily in an optimized way, and I'll try to explain that. And I think I was a red teamer, offensive mindset for a big part of my career. And a lot of the industry is driven by this. And I'm not saying it's bad, right? I think having an offensive mindset is good. But security researchers, the good ones, the good hackers, and good security research and pen testers and red teamers are generally far more sophisticated than actual attacks. And so what happens is, and looking back at my career, I can see that I did that too. I would come to a place, I would do a red team, I would come with those super creative ways to get in. I never fail. I always get in, right? Always. But some of these times I get in a ways that are way beyond what most organizations are doing. And as a result, it drives certain behavior in the industry, and people are doing these protection layers on certain things that are very advanced. Where in reality, when I became an incident responder, I discovered that I see what's really happening, not what can theoretically happen. Theoretically, there are 5,000 different ways to hack in, but practically, most of them look the same. So, for instance, right now in the cloud, there are different statistics, but any number between 50 and 75% of attacks are identity theft-based attack. Info stealers, phishing, compromised accounts, some variance in that, and then I go in. And so I would put substantially more investment on identity protection. What we did, for instance, what we did in Mitiga is that we added a third factor, which is device-based authentication. So even if somebody falls for phishing with MFA circumvention, which happens all the time, hopefully not in Mitiga, but I'm realistic. But even if that happens, it doesn't help because they don't have the device, right? And so this. And again, maybe I'm lying to myself, right? Security is all about what you perceive. But I believe this control, which is not so complicated to implement, it is not trivial, it's not so complicated, gives me way more value than any other control that would cost me that amount of effort.
I completely agree. I think that at the end of the day, hackers are like water. They go for the path of least resistance.
Exactly.
And I always say that, like, when I compare it to physical security. When I used to live in Israel, I used to live in a small village. Now, because I love dogs and I have big German Shepherd and Malinois, and I always had big dogs. Since I was like 4 years old, I had German Shepherds and growing up. So we have a very large yard. So we have a fence and the German Shepherd is just roaming around the yard.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't do that to prevent physical intrusion into my home, but my neighbors don't have a German Shepherd and they don't have a fence. So they're easier targets. I think that a lot of companies and a lot of people think that cyber crime and cyber and hacking is personal. It's not personal. It's business.
Yes.
And they'll go, in most cases, unless it's like a targeted attack, and we know that happens, absolutely. But I think it all starts with people really analyzing who will attack them and why. What is the motivation? Because if it's just a random attack and they want to make money, I just want to be a little a little harder to attack than my next door neighbor. Not because I don't like them, I like them, they're good friends, but no offense, I like me better.
Do you
So,
remember when they would steal cars in Israel and we would do these locks on
yes.
the gear shift, so the
Yes.
stick, and then people would show, oh yeah, but you can cut it with a disc saw in like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
But it doesn't
But
matter because the car
exactly, it's not
next to you
personal.
doesn't have it.
Exactly. It's just making it a little bit harder. If it's personal, they'll cut the
Yeah.
chain. But if it's not personal, they'll just go for the next car. So you've been involved in so many attacks and incidents throughout the years. And can you talk a little bit about the lesson learned? You talked about investing in the right places, in the cloud, for example, identity theft, and I completely agree. But what would you say your biggest lesson learned from those various attacks you've seen throughout the years?
Wow, there's so many.
True.
Um, I would say, and again, I may be biased because I'm now an incident responder, but I would say managing the incident response correctly is the most important thing. You're breached or you will be breached. That's fine. You won't be measured at the end on why you were breached. At some level you will, but 80% you will be measured on how you managed the breach. And we've seen companies that manage breaches poorly and it hits them. I mean, look at LastPass, right?
Mm-hmm.
They got breached 3 times, probably. And again, I'm being cautious here. I didn't investigate their breach, but from the indicators, they didn't. The second breach was a result of something missed in the
Yes.
investigation of the first breach. And so, first breach, fine. Even though it's a password manager, nobody really cared. It happens.
Yeah.
Third breach, again, part of it tied to previous ones, not good. Same with Okta. 3 breaches in a row, throwing deception, telling lies to the public. Don't do that. It's
But my biggest problem is the fact that the public doesn't seem to care too much. And that's
well,
also, what, like,
some of the public doesn't,
yeah,
but the security industry does.
yeah,
Some of
that's
it.
true. So let's
And
talk a little bit about culture because I think that's a huge thing, both in organizations that need to think about incident response and cybersecurity in general, and the public. How do we approach? Do you have any tips of how can we approach building that culture, building that understanding of why it's important to choose a tool that it might have been breached, fine, but breached once, fine. Breached 3 times in a row for the same thing because you didn't fix it, less so. How do we approach that?
so I think, security culture is very, very hard. It's a struggle I'm working through my entire life. People who don't live in security, who don't practice risk daily, just struggle to relate to that, right? And it's not going to change. And to be honest, we need to understand that it's not going to change. So these attempts to say, oh, we'll make everybody a security champion, we'll build culture. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I mean, just on technical people, we try to do this, developer training, things like that. They don't. And so we need to give them enough to care, but we also need to make it in a way that's easy. I mean, if you look at Okta is a great example, right?
Yeah.
Um, we've seen a lot of challenges with their security approach, the way they manage incidents, some of their responses to advisories and issues. But that's partly because they have a really, really great culture of enabling identity management. And so they're not, I always say, and I apologize if somebody takes it the wrong way, they're not a security company, they're an identity enablement company, right? And so
Yeah.
they made it possible to deploy single sign-on way before anybody else because they're so good at that. It comes with compromises at some places, right? So Okta stores your passwords in clear text. Why? Because that's the only way they could support really unified single sign-on into legacy applications that don't support SAML. They would just send the password, right? Is
Yeah.
it great? No. Did it help them adopt? Yes. And so I think we need to live in a world where we understand that we need to make compromises in security so that people are getting something from it. So security comes with the right usability, and it's good for them, and it's nice for them, and and they can live with it rather than try and scare everybody to be us.
I couldn't agree more. I think that single sign-on is, and I'm not talking about Okta specifically, but I think single sign-on as a solution is a great example of how we can enhance security while making life easier for people. Like, I don't expect the general public, let's be honest, I can't remember, at least I would say I have probably between 40 and 50 active accounts that I use on a weekly basis.
Right.
It's impossible to remember completely different 40 or 50 completely different passwords. That's not something that's going to happen. So either single sign-on or 2FA or password convention or password manager. But these are all things that are in place to help us enhance our security while enabling people to work. So I think
Yes.
there is a trade-off. I think that we should do more about making the general public understand why it's important, just like the general public understand why it's important to put on their seat belts and adhere to the
But
signs that they see. But
but look at seatbelts. I'm gonna challenge you here. Seatbelts
okay,
is a great example. People wear seatbelts not because it's important, or well, most people. They wear seatbelts because it's the law. I still remember as a kid, there wasn't a law for seatbelts in the back seats, and we would go without seatbelts in the back seat. Now I
uh,
can't imagine not buckling my kids in
but
the
I
back seat.
but I think it's also, I agree that it started because of the law. I think, but throughout the years there were so many campaigns that I think that it's something that you do without thinking. You go in the car, you put on your seatbelt,
Right.
that's it.
Because we
And for me,
because it became the norm, but it became the norm through the law, not through
maybe,
education. And I think
maybe I
and
think it's
and
both.
and I think if you look at what Apple just did with the new
Yeah.
macOS and iOS, where they took these bits and pieces and put in a really nice, well put up password manager, I think that's the step in the right direction. Because downloading one pass is already way beyond what most people do. But getting it built in with your Mac, and now every time you're going to register at a new website, it's going to offer, oh, I'll just invent a new password for you and keep it for you.
And Chrome has been doing it for years.
Yes,
And you
but
know
it's
what?
not
I've
cross. But it's not across everything, right? It's only web.
true. But I'm saying, well, most applications that you need are web based today. So I think these are steps in the right direction. But it
Yeah.
still needs, we know that we need more. I'm not sure how exactly to get there, but that's a whole different story. You've been a public speaker for so many years, and you've been an advocate for cybersecurity in various forums across the world. I've seen a little bit of a shift throughout the years because we've known each other for many years. But I want to ask you, what are the topics that you are really passionate about discussing and why?
Well, obviously, the ones we're discussing now. So incident response, um, and this shift of understanding of what is really dangerous and how do organizations really reduce risk and pain and impact, and facilitate that into their business. I think I've grown a lot as a professional throughout these years. I'm a technical guy, a hacker. I know how to break things. I used to talk a lot about breaking things and how to break into things. Um, I think today I speak more about how to help organizations bounce back from breaches. I think one of my passions, obviously, I'm mostly in the cloud, is that people just don't yet understand how different incident response in the cloud is. It's still amazing, as I meet prospects in meetings, I still realize, oh yeah, we just adapted some of our tooling, some of this, our SIM, our SOC, or it's like you're just not there yet. But at the same time, luckily, the more advanced attacks are still not massively happening in the cloud as they are on endpoint, right? You put an endpoint out, it gets compromised 5 seconds. Cloud takes a little longer, but it's coming, and it's coming big. And I think organizations are not really ready for that. I mean, look at what happened with Snowflake, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't a fancy breach at all. It wasn't even a breach of Snowflake, right? It was just stealing credentials with info stealers and then building an automated tool that finds where they work and then massively downloading. None of the organizations we spoke with were really ready for that. None of them were looking or doing detection on Snowflake, right? It's a SaaS. Why do we need whatever? Um, None of them had the knowledge how to hunt for this specific activity because it's not something. Even if you had detection rules of Snowflake, they're probably not going to hit because somebody used legitimate credentials and did queries, right? And so now that you know it's going, how do you hunt for it? How do you understand what data was stolen? Snowflake logs are not logs as other systems are. They're a table in their database. And so these things are going to happen more and more, and organizations are not enough set up for that. And that's, so that's what I'm passionate about. That's what I do. That's why I built Mitigat.
Fantastic. You talked about your background as a hacker, and now as on the other side of the realm. You talked a little bit about the mindset as a hacker, as a penetration tester, as a technical person. And I know that a lot of our listeners are people either in early stages of their career or even just looking at getting into cybersecurity. And I want to ask you, what sort of advice would you give people looking to get into this industry or grow in this industry? How can they grow that mindset? How can they understand risk in a better way?
So I'm going to say something before I get into the specifics. I'm going to say something that I say on every career and on every advice. Find your passion. And so find if this is something you're passionate about or what within this realm you can be passionate about. Because, we all want a good job that pays good money. But if you're not passionate about your job in cybersecurity, you're probably not going to get very far. It's a very complicated field. And it evolves rapidly, which means you need to stay up to date and you need to get into the details. And if you're not passionate about it, it's very hard to do. And then you get into this vicious cycle where you're not passionate, you don't get good enough, you get mediocre jobs, you hate them, you're less passionate, and then you end up in this rut. So find what you're passionate about. I think the best hackers are people that are passionate about building and breaking things. And most of the people I know in this industry that are really great at red teaming were doing things with computers as kids or whatever. They wouldn't just use the computer. They would try to understand, how does it work? How do I break it apart? How do I make it do something that's not supposed to do? And that passion drives them throughout their career. And if you're not passionate about that, that's fine. There's compliance, there's risk, there's process, there are a lot of things, there's managing people, there are a lot of things that you can do in the industry, but you first need to find your passion. Having said that, I will say that for the more, let's say, hands-on technical roles, this notion of understanding how things work and how you break them and how you can make them do things they're not supposed to is super critical, because that's security. And I always, whenever I would guide new people, when pen testing day, they would come in, look, I broke this. It's like, I hacked this. It's like, okay, great. How did you hack it? Oh, I did this and this and this. Okay. And then what happened on the other side? Why did it work? And they're like, I don't know. It's like, okay, so you accidentally hacked it because you don't know how you did it. So go back and spend the next hour figuring out why it worked, right? Because they would do a SQL injection that they saw something. So you have to understand how things work. And when you understand, you suddenly get this clarity. You see a system, you get this clarity. You understand how things work, and you can break it. You can secure it. You can understand how that attacker got in, right? If you want to be an incident responder, you need to understand how people break in.
Yeah. And you have to start, that's why we always start with the reconnaissance, understand what you're going to break into. And I love that, by the way, you mentioned passion, but you mentioned also the perspective on understanding why it works on the other side. And I would add to that, why would that be a target? Why would a hacker want to attack this server? Is it useful? Like if it's the, I don't know, photo server from our days out,
Mhm.
I mean, it will be a bummer to lose all those photos, but we can probably live with it as an organization. We're not going to pay for this. So, I love the fact that you started with passion, and I'm very passionate about talking about cyber passion. We had that discussion before, and I think that for people like yourself, like me, passion is what drives us. And I want to talk about the fact that you've been in this industry for 30 years. You've seen it evolve from the very early stages of still using modems to the AI boom of today. And we will talk about AI because otherwise, what kind of show will we be? But I want to ask you,
Remind
how
me,
do you
what is
stay?
AI?
I don't know. It's the thing that we use sometimes. So I want to ask you, you said passion and you mentioned continually evolving and learning and everything. How do you stay up to date with all those rapid changes in this crazy industry?
So, that ties back to passion. These things interest me. And so because they interest me, I I want to read about it, right? So if I see now a story about something, I have to read it. I'm interested, right? Um, and so that's the baseline. And of course, it's a combination. You know me. I'm really into WhatsApp groups. So I have a lot of cybersecurity WhatsApp groups, and so that's
That's
a
our
really
RSS.
it's like an RSS, but it's just I don't know. For me, it's a good way to consume. I like chat. I type very fast, so chat has always been my favorite mean of communication because I can multitask and parallel and communicate with multiple people at the same time. So I get this feed things. People talk about things. Something catches my eye. I read about it. There was the other day. This article about how somebody circumvented an anti-phishing company to do phishing through them. I won't mention names. And it really caught my eye because it wasn't I hacked something that's every day, but I used them against their own thing. And it's like you had one job. And
Well, I think it's, by the way, I think it's a brilliant story. But
yeah,
it is, I mean, it's so cynical. I'm an evil person, so I really like that story. I'm sorry. I'm an evil
and
person.
again, because I like hacking, I saw that I couldn't not read it, right? And so that's how I stay up to date. And it comes back to saying, you have to have passion. By the way, it's true in every occupation. Right? If you're passionate about being a doctor, that my general physician, she's really great because she's passionate about being a doctor. So I can always tell that she's up to date with the latest research, with the latest knowledge. Whereas my previous one, it was just a job for him. And so whatever he finished studying through his medical education, good, but 20 years later, he's not there yet. And so every job, and I think it's the same, but yeah, you have to stay up to date. I see what we do IR, so that helps me stay up to date. And just spend time being involved. I'll tell you another story about that though. So a few years ago when I was working in Synopsys, there was this whole IoT, automotive IoT stuff, and I figured I want to learn more about IoT security and IoT. And I have this deficiency where I'm really bad at learning things theoretically. I never graduated university because for me, just learning things for in theory doesn't work. So I have to learn through doing. And so I figured, how will I learn about IoT? So I decided I'll build a smart home, but I'm not going to call anybody to build me a smart home. I would do it myself. So I started researching and understanding the different technologies. There's Z-Wave and Zigbee and whatever, and bought a bunch of devices and learned what I need on electricity and put them in the walls. And that's of course an overkill because I could have learned a lot less theoretically, but through that I really got a notion, not just of okay, there's IoT, it's low powered, but what are the limitations of low power? Some areas, things like connection timeouts out and wake up call timeout and things like that. And you understand so much by doing. So, a lot of people I know in the industry, even though they work 9, 10, 11 hours a day on computers, they still do stuff outside of work with their computer as
Exactly.
well.
I think that's sort of the point. You mentioned passion, and I think that your story is very inspirational, I hope, for people, because you're a serial entrepreneur. It's not like you're sitting in your 9 to 5 job doing whatever and then you sit. No, owning a business, building a startup is, for those who are listening, it's hard work. You can share
Oh,
the long hours,
man.
especially in incident response. Like, honestly, I salute you. I'm too old for this. Honestly, like the first thing that came to mind when I saw the CrowdStrike, whatever, I won't say what kind of show. The first thing that came to mind was, thank God I'm not the CISO of anything right now. Like, it was like a sigh of relief. I can enjoy my weekend and just
Yeah,
monitor it.
incidents
So
tend to materialize just as the weekend
always,
begins. That's
always,
always the case.
always. Why? Why? I think it's despite.
It's
No, but I
it's
think
on
that
purpose. What do you mean, why?
Oh, okay. No, that's for sure. By the way, that's why attackers do it. But yeah, and we know that Shamoon started during Ramadan, and we've seen a lot of incidents like that. But I want to mention, the reason I mentioned it is you're so busy, and yet you're so passionate, and you find the time. And I think that when I tell people you have to stay up to date, lifelong learning, you have to always adapt, always evolve, stay up to date. People think that no, I can never do that. I can't allocate 5 hours a day just to learn new things. You don't have to. It could be 5 minutes one day, 50 minutes the next, and three
Right.
hours the next. And if you make it a habit, and for you, for me, it's mostly using our LinkedIn slash WhatsApp slash Telegram groups, but it could also be active and look for things, and you see something that catches your eye, look for it in another source. So that's great. So just stay up to date. And I think that if you can do it, then most people probably can do it.
Yeah,
Probably.
you mentioned being a founder. If you talk about passionate, if you ever think about starting a company, just know, don't do it for the money. Maybe you'll get it, sure, but you can't get through a startup life if you're not very passionate
Oh,
about
yeah.
what you're doing. Because as you said, startup is hard. I love it, but it's hard.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We're reaching almost top of the hour. So I want to ask you, before we move into the pop quiz, we've seen this industry evolve so much, and everyone is talking about AI. So let's talk about AI in general, and sort of where do you see this? And let's focus on incidents and breaches and cyber attacks. How do you see it evolving over the next, let's say, 5 years?
So that's a really interesting question, and I'll be very careful because predictions are, given to the fools. But I think AI is now, last year it was worse, but I think it's still now at the point where it's not a solution to a problem, but a solution seeking a problem, right? So we saw that in a real extreme and not, with a very bad outcome at the end with blockchain. With blockchain came out, I'm putting
Everyone was
aside
talking about it.
cryptocurrency, but blockchain as a technology, we saw all these organizations trying to think, oh, what can I do with blockchain? And that's this thing when there's a trend, people stop being reasonable because we don't say, oh, I have this piece of technology, let's look what I can do with it. So, oh, I have a problem, let's see how I best solve it, right? But people just have to do this. And then I think AI obviously is that on steroids. I do believe AI is going to be way more valuable than blockchain. But what we see right now is a lot of places where AI is put for you need to have AI. Everybody expects you to have an AI, and we see that. With that said, I do think for detection and response, AI has a big potential, and I'm careful because everybody's already launched a million of products in the space, but for now, I still feel the value they bring is limited. They do have a great potential in summarizing, bringing data, but we need as an industry to build them a lot more. This notion, oh, I'll just let AI find from the logs what's interesting. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It doesn't work well. And we need more. But given the fact that we are, I don't know what's the latest number, but around 7 or 8 million jobs short in the world in cybersecurity, we definitely need more and more AI to make the people that we have work better. It's not about replacing people, it's about helping them be more efficient. And I use AI for some things on a daily basis. But I mean, even small things, right? When Gen AI started being popular, I think a lot of us would write blog posts and LinkedIn posts with, oh, I'll just give it a few bullets, it will write it for me. And I stopped doing it because it all looks like AI wrote it, right? But I do let it proofread my content.
Exactly. So I let it proofread and I let it take pieces of content that I created and generate it into something new. So for example, I just created this entire, let's call it mini guide ebook, I don't even know what to call it, based on a talk that I gave. So I just used my AI companion to do the transcript, put it in AI, told him generate it. Now, I'm not saying it did it automatically, and that's exactly the point with incident response as well. I don't need it to do automatically. It's not creative. It's not going to create the presentation for me, but if I give it the content that I want, it will make life much easier than if I would have taken this transcript and started building it into an ebook.
And again, it's a tool, and we need to start treating it as, okay, there are problems where this tool is good for, and let's use it. I heard something really funny a few months ago. Said AI is this great technology where on one side somebody writes 5 bullets and lets AI turn it into a blog, and on the other side somebody uses AI to turn it into 5 bullets because they don't have time to read the blog.
Exactly. Oh, I love that. Ofer, before we finish this episode, I always like to finish up with a very quick pop quiz. Short questions, short answers, whatever comes to mind. Ready? Okay. So, what's one technology or tool you couldn't live without in your day-to-day life?
WhatsApp.
Yeah, probably. What's the most unexpected place your cybersecurity journey ever took you?
The carnival in Rio.
Seriously? I want to go to the carnival in Rio. How did you get there? No, this is we can't just stop.
I thought it was a pop quiz. Okay, it was the hectic days. We had reached to some customer in Brazil. They wanted a apprentice. So the carnival is the end of the summer vacation. So they wanted a apprentice, and they wanted it to start the first day that the summer vacation ends. And so we had to fly a week earlier.
I mean, you do what you do. It's a necessity. Oh, that is fantastic. I need to go. If someone's listening and wants me to come to the carnival to do, I don't know what, but I'll be happy to come. Yeah, fantastic. How do you celebrate your achievements?
Depends. Good Scotch.
You got me there. Okay, fair enough. Can you name someone in your career that opened a door for you when you least expected it?
That's a good question. I don't know if I like the when you least expected for it.
Okay.
But I think the founders of Imperva, Mickey, Amichai, and Shlomo, they took me as a first employee. They put their faith in me. I knew Amichai and Mickey from the military, but still in a very early stage, and gave me a lot of responsibility. And I think it really helped kickstart my career.
Fantastic. I love that. And last but not least, if you could go back in time, what's one piece of advice you would give your younger self?
Get to understand your limitations and drawbacks best and live with them rather than fight them.
I love that. Ofer, thank you so much for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure having you. And I'm sure people will find this episode very inspiring, as I knew they would. So thank you again. And for those listening, don't forget to subscribe and join us next time here on Cybermania.